The autumn of 1886 arrived in the Colorado Territory with a particular cruelty, its winds carrying not the scent of pine and curing hay, but the acrid memory of smoke. For Elara Vance, that memory was a ghost that clung to the blackened timbers of her former life, a skeletal frame against the sharp blue sky where her cabin had once stood. The fire had taken everything but her 2 children, her resolve, and a peculiar idea that was now the subject of open speculation and quiet pity among her neighbors. Instead of clearing the char and starting anew with green timber on the same patch of unforgiving earth, Elara was attacking the low sandstone cliff that bordered her property to the north. With a pickaxe that seemed too heavy for her frame and a shovel worn smooth by her late husband's hands, she was digging, not a foundation for a new house, but the house itself, directly into the soft, ochre-colored rock. It was this activity that first drew the attention of Hiram Poole, a man whose pragmatism was as solid and unyielding as the granite that studded his own fields. He reined in his horse at the edge of Elara's land, his face a mask of profound confusion. He watched her for a long moment, the rhythmic scrape of her shovel against stone the only sound besides the sighing of the wind through the ponderosis. She worked with a grim, unhurried deliberation, her movements economical, born of a body that knew its limits and a mind that had already calculated the immense energy required for the task ahead. Hiram saw not a woman rebuilding, but a woman burrowing, like some frightened animal going to ground. He saw a widow, addled by grief and fear, undertaking a fool's errand while the first warnings of winter painted the aspens in hues of brilliant, fleeting gold. He cleared his throat, a sound meant to announce his presence and his disapproval in a single, gruff note. Elara paused, not to rest, but to listen. She straightened her back, feeling the familiar ache settle deep into her muscles, and turned to face him. Her son, Caleb, all of 7 years, stopped his own small work of piling loose stones and stood beside her, while little Maya watched from a blanket spread near a juniper, her thumb tucked firmly in her mouth. Elara's face was smudged with dust, her hands raw, but her eyes were clear. "Mr. Poole," she said, her voice even, without welcome or dismissal. It was simply a statement of fact. He was there. She was here. And between them lay a chasm of understanding as wide as the valley itself. He saw a hole in a cliff. She saw a sanctuary. "Elara," he began, dismounting and walking closer, his boots crunching on the dry soil. He gestured with a gloved hand towards the charred remains of her home. "The men from town, we can have a raising for you. We can get a new cabin up before the first snows, if we work fast. It'll be green wood, mind you, and it'll weep and settle something fierce, but it's 4 walls and a roof. It's a proper home. Not this." His gesture shifted to the growing cavity in the rock, an act of dismissal that encompassed the entire mad project. His logic was the logic of the community, of survival as it was commonly understood. You fight the wilderness, you raise walls against it, you do not crawl into its stony heart and ask for shelter. Before Elara could form a reply, another voice joined the conversation, lighter and laced with a brittle sympathy that grated on her more than Hiram's blunt disapproval. Dorothea Weiss had arrived in her buggy, a basket of bread and dried apples on the seat beside her, an offering of charity that felt more like an admission ticket to a spectacle. "Oh, you poor dear," she cooed, her eyes wide with a practiced concern that did not quite reach them. "Working yourself to the bone. Hiram is right. You must let the community help you. A woman alone with children, digging in the dirt. It isn't right." She looked from the hole to Elara and then to Hiram, her expression inviting him to share in this assessment of a mind unhinged by tragedy. Amusement, Elara knew, was a safer position than empathy. It required nothing of the observer. Elara looked at the two of them, the embodiment of the valley's collective wisdom. They saw a widow's folly, a desperate and pathetic act. They could not see the principle behind it, the quiet, certain knowledge that guided her hands. "The wood will be green, Mr. Poole," she said, her voice retaining its calm. "It will shrink. The wind will find every new crack. The cold will press against the chinking until it falls away. I've lived through a winter in a new cabin. I know the cost of it." She then turned her gaze to Dorothea, "Thank you for the bread, Dorothea. The children will be grateful." She offered no defense of her work, no explanation. To explain would be to ask for an understanding she knew they were incapable of giving. Their world was built of logs and nails and straight lines. Hers was now one of curves, of yielding to the earth, of seeking an older and more reliable strength. From a distance, watching from her own porch, Constance Hartwell saw the gathering at the Vance property. She saw Hiram's rigid posture and Dorothea's fluttering hands, and she saw Elara standing her ground, small and solitary against the vastness of the cliff face. Constance was a woman who had learned that wisdom was not always loud. She had seen Elara's gardens thrive where others failed, had noted the clever way she'd diverted a small spring to water them, a trick no one else had thought of. She did not understand what Elara was doing, not truly, but she withheld judgment. She recognized the look in the other woman's eyes, a look she had seen in master craftsmen and seasoned trackers. The quiet confidence of someone who was not guessing, but working from a blueprint invisible to everyone else. She decided to wait and to watch. The memory that fueled Elara was not of her husband, Thomas. He had been a good man, a strong builder, but his knowledge was of the kind Hiram Poole possessed. It was the knowledge of mortise and tenon, of saddle-notching logs, of the eternal battle to keep the outside out. Thomas would have started rebuilding the cabin the day after the fire, his grief channeled into the familiar violence of axe and saw. He would have raised the walls, and they would have shivered through the winter together, feeding the stove constantly, waking to frost on their blankets. He would have called this survival. But Elara remembered something else, a different kind of knowledge passed down from her grandfather, a man who had lived with the Ute people as a boy and had learned to read the land not as an adversary, but as a partner. Her grandfather had never built a house in his life, but he had understood shelter. He had taught her to watch the badgers, how their dens, dug deep into the south-facing slopes, were always the last to be covered by snowdrifts and the first to be clear in the spring. He had shown her how the snow itself was a blanket, how the small creatures survived beneath its deep, insulating layer, protected from the killing winds above. Watching an outcome, he used to say, is not the same as understanding the principle. The badger was not just digging a hole. It was using the earth itself. The earth, he explained, was a vast, slow reservoir of warmth. In the summer, it drank the heat of the sun, storing it deep within. In the winter, it exhaled that warmth with a slowness that could outlast any blizzard. It was a principle of thermal mass, a phrase he never used, but a concept he understood in his bones. This understanding was solidified by a more recent memory, one from her own marriage. 2 years prior, Thomas had consented to digging a proper root cellar, not a shallow pit but a deep chamber carved into the very same sandstone bluff she was now excavating. He had complained about the work, calling it excessive, but Elara had insisted. That first winter, their potatoes and carrots had remained crisp and perfect, while the Pooles and the Weiss's stores, kept in shallow cellar pits beneath their cabins, had frozen solid during a week of deep cold. In the height of the following summer, when the air in her cabin was stifling, the root cellar had been a sanctuary of coolness, the air inside still and chilled. The earth did not care about the season. It simply existed in a state of profound equilibrium, a slow-moving average of the year's temperatures. She had tried to explain this to Hiram once, as he stood there shaking his head. "The rock holds the warmth, Mr. Poole," she had said, pausing in her labor. "The sun warms it all summer. A small fire inside will keep that warmth from leaving. The earth will be my walls. It won't shrink or crack. The wind won't be able to find a way in." He had looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language, his face clouded with a mixture of pity and impatience. "That's cave thinking, Elara. It's damp. It's dark. It's no place for children. You'll all catch your death from the lung fever before the first thaw." He saw only a damp hole, imagining water seeping through the rock. He did not understand the dry, porous nature of this particular sandstone formation, something Elara had carefully observed for years. His mind was closed, locked in the prison of the conventional. So she stopped explaining and simply worked. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Her labor was a brutal, monotonous rhythm of strike, pry, and shovel. The sandstone was softer than granite, but it was still stone. Her pickaxe would ring against a harder inclusion, sending jarring vibrations up her arms. She learned to read the subtle changes in the rock's color and texture, finding the softer veins and following them. Each evening, she would return to the temporary shelter she'd built, a crude lean-to of salvaged planks against a rock outcropping, and collapse onto her pallet, her muscles screaming in protest. She would rub liniment onto her blistered hands by the light of a flickering lamp, her children sleeping soundly beside her, their small bodies a constant, potent reminder of why she could not fail. The pile of excavated rock and earth grew into a small hill. She used the wheelbarrow Thomas had built to haul it away, load by painful load, dumping it to form a wide, flattened terrace in front of the growing opening. This was not wasted effort. The terrace would become their front yard, a dry, elevated space that would not turn to mud in the spring melt. Caleb, seeing his mother's exhaustion, began to help in earnest, his small shovel moving a fraction of what hers did. But his effort was a balm to her spirit. He was learning the rhythm of the work, the quiet language of persistence. He sorted the rock, placing the larger, flatter pieces to one side, instinctively understanding they would have a purpose later. When the interior space was finally large enough, a rough chamber about 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough for her to stand upright, the second phase of the work began. She had to create a front wall, a facade to close the opening and provide a place for a door and a window. For this, she used the fire-blackened timbers from the cabin. They were charred and ugly, but the fire had only eaten the surface. The heartwood was still strong. She spent 2 days scraping them clean of the worst of the soot, the black dust coating her face and clothes, a grim baptism into her new life. With a saw and chisel, she painstakingly squared the ends, fashioning a heavy frame that she would set into the mouth of her cave. This was the heaviest work, and she could not do it alone. She had to devise a system of levers and fulcrums using smaller logs and stout rocks to inch the massive lintel beam into place atop the 2 upright posts. It was a slow, dangerous process. A slip could mean being crushed. She worked with an almost meditative focus, her mind entirely present, calculating angles and forces. She thought of her grandfather again, how he had taught her to move a heavy rock by understanding its balance point, not by fighting its weight. She nudged and pivoted the great beam, a fraction of an inch at a time, until with a final, groaning shudder, it settled perfectly into the notches she had carved. She stood back, breathing heavily, and felt a surge of triumph that was fierce and intensely private. She had done it. With the main frame in place, she began to fill in the gaps. Using the flat stones Caleb had collected, she and the boy laid a dry-stacked stone wall on either side of the space that would become the door. They packed mud and sod into the crevices, creating a surprisingly tight seal. For the upper portion of the wall, she used salvaged planks from the cabin floor, fitting them tightly together. She left a single, square opening for the window she had miraculously found intact in the rubble, its frame scorched but the glass unbroken. The final piece was the door itself, a thick, heavy thing she constructed from the stoutest planks, hung on salvaged iron hinges that she had spent an entire afternoon hammering straight. When she pulled it shut for the first time, the interior was plunged into a deep, resonant quiet, the world of wind and worry sealed away. The final task inside was to manage the floor and the smoke. The floor was uneven, and she spent days leveling it with a tamper, then laying down the smoothest, flattest stones she could find, fitting them together like a rugged mosaic. In the rear of the chamber, she carved a smaller opening into the ceiling, angling it up and through the rock until it breached the cliff face 20 feet above. This was her chimney. It was not a perfect flue, but it would draw. Directly beneath it, she set up the small, pot-bellied stove, another survivor of the fire, its cast-iron body scarred but sound. The stovepipe fit snugly into the opening she had made. The house of earth and rock was ready. It was not beautiful, but it was solid. It was hers. The first true test came in mid-November. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hard blue for weeks, turned the color of slate. The air grew still and heavy with a cold that felt ancient and predatory. The first flakes of snow began to drift down, fat and wet, and then the wind rose, driving the snow sideways in a thick, churning curtain. This was the beginning of the first real storm of the season, the kind of blizzard that announced winter's dominion. In their old cabin, this would have been a moment of anxiety. Elara would have been stuffing rags into the ever-present drafts, listening to the wind shriek through the eaves, and constantly feeding wood into the hungry stove just to keep the chill at bay. Inside the dugout, the experience was profoundly different. The roar of the blizzard was a distant, muffled whisper, like the sound of a faraway ocean. There were no drafts. The single window, which she had carefully sealed with clay, showed only a solid, moving wall of white. The air inside was still and, to her profound relief, growing steadily warmer. She had lit a small, modest fire in the stove hours earlier, using seasoned juniper that burned hot and clean. The iron of the stove radiated an intense heat, but it was the walls themselves that were performing the miracle she had counted on. When she placed her palm against the cool sandstone, she could feel a deep, resonant warmth slowly blooming within it. The rock was absorbing the heat, taming it, turning it from a fierce, localized source into a gentle, pervasive comfort that filled the entire space. This was the period of faith, the time of waiting. The science was sound, her grandfather's wisdom was true, but every homesteader's life was a testament to the brutal gap between theory and reality. For 2 days, the storm raged. Elara did not need to leave her shelter. She had water, food, and a small but sufficient pile of firewood stacked against the back wall. She tended the fire with a miser's care, adding a log only when the stove began to cool. A small fire, not a large one. That was the key. A large fire would overheat the air and the smoke would not draw properly. A small, steady fire allowed the stone to do its work, to become a gentle radiator, a battery of warmth. She watched her children, Caleb and Maya, who were playing quietly on the floor with carved wooden animals. They were not huddled in blankets. Their cheeks were pink. They were comfortable. On the third morning, she woke to a profound silence. The wind had died. The world outside the window was no longer a swirling vortex of white, but a still, bright expanse. She pushed open the heavy door, and the light that flooded the dugout was dazzling. A pure, blue-white glare reflected off a world remade. The snow was piled in immense drifts, sculpted by the wind into fantastical shapes. It was at least 4 feet deep on the level, and the top of Hiram Poole's new, green-timbered barn was barely visible across the valley. But her own terrace, the one she had built from the excavated earth, was mostly clear, the wind having scoured it clean. The snow was piled high against the front of her dwelling, but it did not block the door. It was simply another layer of insulation, a gift from the storm. She breathed in the clean, frigid air. It was sharp and thin, a stark contrast to the gentle warmth behind her. She took a step out, her boots sinking deep into the powder. The silence was absolute. No birds, no squirrels, just the immense, white stillness of the world after a blizzard. She looked at her home, the rough-hewn facade nestled into the cliff, a plume of gray smoke rising lazily from the hidden chimney high above. It looked less like a house and more like a natural feature of the landscape, something that had always been there. It looked like it belonged. For the first time since the fire, a feeling of deep, unshakable security settled over her. She had not merely built a shelter. She had found a partnership with the land itself. The sensory proof was undeniable. It was in the feel of the air on her skin, warm and even throughout the room, without the cold pockets that had plagued the cabin. It was in the sound, the deep, comforting quiet that the thick stone walls provided. It was in the smell of the dry earth, mixed with the faint, pleasant scent of burning juniper. But most of all, it was in the sight of her children, thriving. Maya had not coughed once since they had moved in, her breathing easy and deep in the still, draft-free air. Caleb was reading by the light of the window, his stockinged feet resting on the warm stone floor. This was the vindication, a private and profound victory experienced not in the eyes of others, but in the simple, irrefutable reality of her family's well-being. She remembered her grandfather's words again. Understand the principle. The principle was that the earth held its warmth. It did not create it, but it held it with a stubborn, patient persistence that could never match. The cabin had fought the cold, a constant, losing battle of fire against air. This place did not fight. It simply held a small pocket of warmth within a much larger vessel of thermal stability. It was the difference between a frantic shouting match and a quiet, confident statement. Her small fire was not battling the entire Colorado winter. It was merely topping up the immense store of warmth already present in the tons of rock that surrounded them. It was 2 days later when a figure appeared, struggling through the deep drifts on snowshoes. It was Hiram Poole. His face was grim, his beard caked with ice. He had come, she knew, on a mission of grim duty, expecting to find a tragedy, to rescue a foolish woman and her children from a frozen tomb. He carried a heavy blanket roll and a sack that likely held food. As he drew closer, he stopped, his expression of grim resolve slowly melting into one of utter bafflement. He saw the smoke rising. He saw Caleb outside on the terrace, energetically clearing the last patches of snow with a small shovel. The boy was in his shirt sleeves. Hiram trudged onto the terrace, his snowshoes making a soft crunching sound. "Elara?" he called out, his voice hesitant, as if unsure of what he was seeing. Elara appeared in the doorway. She held a steaming mug in her hands. "Mr. Poole," she said, her tone as even as it had been weeks before. "It is good of you to check on us." She made no move to gloat, no gesture of "I told you so." The simple fact of her and her children, alive and well, was statement enough. She stepped aside, a silent invitation for him to enter. He hesitated for a moment, then stooped to enter the low doorway. The change was instantaneous and shocking. He stepped from a world of biting 20-degree air into a room that was comfortable. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light, his senses trying to process the impossible. It was not the stifling, oppressive heat of an overworked stove in a small space. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. He looked at the stove, which glowed with a mild, cherry-red heat, and then at the stone walls, the floor. He slowly pulled off a glove and pressed his bare hand against the sandstone wall beside the door. It was not cold. It was impossibly warm to the touch. He stood there for what felt like a full minute, his hand pressed against the rock, his mind wrestling with the evidence of his senses against a lifetime of ingrained certainty. He saw the children healthy and calm. He felt the air, still and warm. He saw the neat stack of firewood, barely diminished. His own new cabin, for all its thick logs, was a misery of drafts. The green wood had shrunk in the dry, cold air, opening up 100 tiny fissures for the wind to knife through. His family was living in a constant state of shivering, huddled near a roaring fire that consumed wood at an alarming rate. And here, in this hole, was a quiet, steady comfort he could not comprehend. Finally, he dropped his hand and looked at Elara. He looked at her not as a foolish widow, but as someone who possessed a knowledge that he did not. The pity and condescension were gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, unvarnished respect. "I'll be," he said, the words soft with wonder. He shook his head slowly. "I would not have believed it." He looked around the space again, at the simple, functional way it was arranged. Then his eyes met hers again. "You were right, Elara. We were wrong." It was a simple admission, spoken in a low voice, but in the quiet of the dugout, it resonated with the weight of a church bell. That afternoon, Elara shared her knowledge, not as a victor, but as a neighbor. As they drank hot chicory coffee, she explained it all again. She told him about her grandfather, about the badgers, about the deep-root cellar. She explained the principle of the earth as a storehouse for heat. She talked about the small, steady fire, and how the rock did most of the work. This time, Hiram Poole listened. He did not interrupt. He did not scoff. He asked questions, sharp, practical questions about the depth, the ventilation, the way she sealed the window. He was a man whose world had been upended, But he was also a practical man, and he knew a better way when he saw it, even if it shattered his own assumptions. The story of Elara's warm cave spread through the valley almost as fast as the blizzard had. It became the season's great curiosity. Dorothea Weiss came, her basket of charity replaced by a burning, gossipy need to see for herself, and left in a state of stunned silence. Constance Hartwell came, and she smiled, a slow, knowing smile. She did not express surprise, only a quiet affirmation. "I knew you were working from a plan, Elara," was all she said. Others followed, and to each of them Elara patiently explained the principle. She held nothing back. It was not her secret to keep. It was a truth of the earth, available to anyone with the sense to see it and the will to do the work. That winter was one of the harshest in memory, but for Elara and her children, it was their most comfortable. They were untouched by the winds, untroubled by the deep, persistent cold. While her neighbors burned through their woodpiles and fought endless battles against the cold, Elara's family lived in a state of quiet, stable warmth. Her innovation, born of desperation and observation, had given them more than just shelter. It had given them peace. In the years that followed, the Vance dugout ceased to be a curiosity and became a local landmark, a testament to ingenuity. Hiram Poole, eating his humble pie, spent the next summer helping a newly arrived family with little money for timber to carve a similar, smaller dwelling into a hillside on their claim. He did not do it perfectly, but he remembered the principles Elara had taught him. The idea began to spread. People didn't abandon their log cabins, but the value of the earth as an insulator was no longer dismissed. Root cellars were dug deeper. Some farmers built spring houses and smokehouses partially into hillsides, noting how they held a more constant temperature. The hard-won knowledge of a lone woman slowly, quietly, became the common wisdom of the valley. Elara's home, improved over the years with a wooden floor and plastered interior walls, was lived in by her family for another 50 years. A warm, quiet sanctuary that stood as proof that sometimes the most profound strength comes not from standing against the forces of nature, but from finding a way to shelter within them.